Hi everyone, this is Arthi from Human Chapters. A happy 2022 to all of you. I'll tell you a bit about Human Chapters. Humans are living narratives with a past, present and future. These narratives constitute of a number of chapters across a lifespan. The aim of these conversations is to highlight a chapter of the narrative and unpack its connections to other chapters. I don't care whether people are natural storytellers, but I truly do believe each one of us has a story to share. An acknowledgement to country. We acknowledge the traditional owners of the land which now comprises Greater Shepparton. We pay respect to their tribal elders past and present and emerging. We celebrate their continuing culture and we acknowledge the memory of their ancestors. And today we are talking to Rachel about her chapter, From Social Emotional Learning to Social Justice and Literacy. So I'll pass on the floor to Rachel to introduce herself. Go for it.
Hi, my name is Rachel, and I am a first grade teacher in Atlanta, Georgia, in the United States. This is my second year as a teacher, and it's really something that I've been passionate about for really as long as I can remember, and that's kind of what this chapter is about, how I've evolved as an educator over time. And that is definitely the heart of my passion in life. Yeah.
Beautiful. Tell us a bit about what got you into education, Rachel.
So when I was a child, I experienced a lot of severe anxiety starting from before elementary school and going through my kind of school career. And it was something that there wasn't a lot of legislation on, there wasn't a lot of teacher education on. And so there really wasn't a lot of support happening in schools for kids with different mental health things that they were dealing with. And so it was something that I was kind of keenly aware of from a very, very young age. And so when I hit about middle school, going into early high school, so for us, that's about like 14 or 15 years old, I thought about the importance of the impact of teachers in those early years for kids with mental health difficulties, but also just kids who experience big feelings in general, which I think is increasingly common in our day and age, and becoming an advocate and an educator of the whole child rather than just focusing on academics, but really supporting kids through those feelings and through those very real moments in their life that impact them outside of their academics, because I think that's an incredibly important part of developing as a human and being able to be a successful adult. And that's like really what we're working on as teachers, helping kids gain all the skills necessary to become successful, independent adults.
Absolutely. So, Rachel, having said or having talked briefly about your like the anxiety in even before going to elementary school, what was that like for you?
A lot of it had to do with fears about things that I felt like were out of my control. And as you know, a 4-year-old and a 5-year-old, most things are out of your control. So whether that be my mom commuting to and from work every day, I really wanted to be like in the driver's seat for that. Essentially, I called her every day. Coming home from work, I couldn't like do homework after school or hang out with friends. Like I had to be on the phone with her, because if I wasn't on the phone with her, I wasn't sure that she would make it home. So it was really kind of limiting and created this kind of rigidity in my structure that I would get extremely panicked if I felt like I couldn't be somewhat in control of like adult situations, essentially. And so that kind of progressed into a lot of stress regarding like perfectionism, social situations at school. Like everyone always says growing up that their favorite things about school are like recess and lunch. And those were like my worst favorite parts. I like dreaded those because there was just no structure that allowed me to like navigate a social situation in an appropriate way. Like I wasn't sure what to do. Whereas during more academic times, I was like, oh, like this is what you're supposed to do. I understand like how to reach a point of success here. It's just like a lot more fluid and nuanced in a social situation, and nobody really teaches you how to like progress through a conversation or build relationships with peers or like read body language, those kinds of things that are more subtle and you either like get them or you don't, depending on what you're doing at home. And so that was really, really challenging for me.
Wow. And how did that did it follow suit in primary school? Were there changes as you grew older? And what was the support like, or the lack of support at a school level?
Yeah, so I started school in the United States at a public elementary school, and that was fine. I didn't really get a lot of extra support from the school itself, but my teachers were pretty understanding. So my individual teachers, and like had conversations with my parents. And then when I transitioned to the public middle school, that's where it like really got bad. And my parents were just like incredibly unhappy with the support that I was able to get. And I was like having a very hard time functioning in a way that was like a normal kid. And so then I transitioned to a very small private school that was an all-girls school. And that was a really like productive, empowering change for me because even though I wasn't like getting like legal supports that you would get in special education, I wasn't getting that anyways, really.
Yeah.
And I was in an environment that was like very safe, and the teachers knew you really well and were able to kind of understand you and accommodate you and help you build skills and confidence that I wouldn't have gotten at the middle school I was at, and then the subsequent like neighborhood high school.
Yeah.
So that was really important for me to go there. I don't think that I would have necessarily found my passion for the advocacy I do in education if I hadn't gone to that school, because it takes a lot of like confidence to be able to put yourself out there in that way. And like baby Rachel would never have been able to do that without that piece. So that support definitely increased. And then I had a really hard time transitioning to university here. I academically was always like really fine because I strove for that perfection factor, but socially, and kind of in terms of a transition to adulthood, I didn't think I could be successful at all. And that's a real shame, right? Because if you have these kids that are succeeding academically in school, like there should be no reason why they feel like they can't succeed in life.
Yeah.
And so clearly there's like a piece missing there,
Mm.
of that social emotional learning that kind of supports the more real life feeling aspects of kids to help them into adulthood. And so that kind of experience transitioning to university and like starting adulthood was also like another wake up call where I was like, whoa, something is really missing here. I feel like kids need a foundation in this and no one's talking about it.
Absolutely. So where did you have a turnaround point? And if so, when was it?
Yeah,
What was it like?
I would say halfway through university, I was really deep in my education classes, and I had a class primarily on classroom management, but we did a really large unit on social emotional learning.
Yeah.
And that's when I kind of like started to have the vocabulary around what it is, how it supports kids, why it's important, like
Mm.
how it makes a difference in the relationships you build with students in a classroom. And then I was really like, wow, like this is what I want to do. And I was really validated in like the lack of support that I had
Yeah.
in elementary school. I kind of felt like, why can't I be quote unquote normal? Why
Mm.
do I need all this extra support? But it's really beneficial to all kids. I mean, I think everybody has something that they struggle with socially, emotionally, maybe not consistently as having kind of a generalized anxiety, but I think everyone experiences anxious feelings in their life or depressive feelings in their life or moments where you're really, really sad and you just like can't, or really, really angry and you don't know how to handle it, or you broach a social situation that's like super awkward and
Mm.
there's no rule book like how to deal with that. So that was really, I think, the turning point for me. Um, and also where I kind of felt like I my calling to be an educator was very much affirmed.
Okay. That's amazing, because that was going to be my next question was, what made you want to become, or what led you to become an educator?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that when I was in high school, I wanted to be the teacher that could support the whole child, that like the little anxious kid in the corner could come up to and we could build a vocabulary for them to talk about their feelings. We could come up with strategies for them to like self-regulate their feelings. And we could have these conversations like individually in small groups or as a whole class to really just kind of build a empathetic, um, thoughtful, and also just like empowered group of kids that would become empathetic, empowered, self-regulated adults.
Yeah.
And I think we're missing a lot of that in our world, unfortunately. And so I'm hopeful that like my work with kids kind of makes some sort of small change
Yeah.
in how people interact with each other, and people feel about themselves and others on a daily basis.
Yeah. Oh, that's really beautiful. Thank you, Rachel. Yeah, going so we've reached university, you've graduated, you've become a
Mhm.
teacher. What has that journey been like for you?
It's been really hard, but like every day like am reminded that my calling is affirmed. Like I feel like I'm doing the work that I'm meant to do.
Yeah.
My first year of teaching was like in the pandemic, so that
Good.
was really hard. My first year I taught completely online kindergarten in New York City, which was like the hub of everything here.
Yes.
And that's really where my shift from, I mean, obviously social emotional learning is still an incredibly big part of my advocacy, and just my daily routine inside of my own classroom. But also, that's kind of where my shift to access to literacy started to happen too. Like once I really reached the classroom,
Mhm.
and saw how much of a kind of disparity there was in terms of quality of literacy education and just like the question of like what literacy education should look like for kids. And like one of my favorite kind of musings that I think about a lot is that like teaching literacy, teaching kids to read, like is social justice. It is a huge social justice impact because like we live in a society where you literally can't function, um, if you don't have access to reading. And the research out there shows that there should be an extremely, extremely minute amount of the population that can't have access to literacy, and yet we have so many struggling readers. So that's when I got into the classroom. I was doing all of my social emotional learning stuff, and that's where I kind of wanted to shift a little bit and focus on literacy, like really strong literacy in my classroom, and also advocacy for really strong literacy in all classrooms.
Absolutely. So let's delve a little bit deeper into the quality of literacy education that you mentioned. What and do a bit of a before and after
Yeah.
sort of thing. What was it like before? Like, what got you thinking about that particular point? And what changes have been made by yourself, by your colleagues, to sort of come to that after point?
So one of the things is in university, I feel like a lot of what you're studying when you become a teacher sometimes is very theoretical, and you don't necessarily get to see all of it in practice in your own classroom, because a lot of student teaching is observing and you're taking on someone else's classroom. And a lot of classrooms in the United States, including the classroom, including the school that I worked at, my first school in New York, focus on what's called like a balanced literacy approach, which leaves a lot up to chance, because it doesn't necessarily focus on what the brain is doing while learning to read. It's a lot of like phonics sprinkled in, and then just like getting kids to like look at books and guess at books. And so there's not really a bridge or connection there that like ensures every child will be able to apply phonics skills to reading. You just kind of hope that they'll pick it up. But as I like started to do more research on this, because that approach like really wasn't making sense for my class, my kindergarten class last year, I mean, there's so much reading instruction that happens in kindergarten, but like most of them came into school not knowing letters, sounds. I mean, at the beginning of the year, I literally taught colors. And so trying to get these kids into books when they had no foundation, and then like sprinkling in some phonics, you know, A says ah or whatever, like that just like wasn't clicking for anybody. And the kids that were like doing well basically like could speak English well, and then like had a bunch of background knowledge about stuff. Like they had like a very conversational home that talked about different animals and talked about different foods, you know, and like that shouldn't be the thing that makes or breaks whether or not you can read, because that's incredibly inequitable. And so I started doing some research on like how the brain learns to read, and I really recalled my experience in university where I was working at the children's hospital, actually, with children with comorbid disabilities, so like multiple disabilities, and one of them was a reading disability. So they would, you know, come in for different like treatment and things at the children's hospital, but then also get literacy intervention, because of course, if they were going to the hospital for things, they were probably missing school. And so I worked with a lot of students with dyslexia or different speech needs, and really started to apply the things that I learned from working with those kids with really specialized needs to a more whole class approach. Like that's what I was giving all of my students. And that like made a huge difference because it wasn't anything like novel or new. Like we've been doing this kind of structured phonics approach where you're really working on the sounds of language, becoming aware of the sounds of language and how they relate to letters, seeing chunks of letters inside of words, and seeing that happen in text authentically, and then writing authentically with those skills. Like that's what we've been doing with children with dyslexia since we like started dealing with like the actual nomenclature of dyslexia in schools. But like most kids actually benefit from that. And so it doesn't make sense that we're doing this balanced literacy approach that only kind of works for some kids when we have this great approach that can target so many more kids, and is not actually that hard to implement or change in a classroom. And so then that's when I kind of started, when I started seeing success with that and approach, I became increasingly like frustrated with my school because of the expectations they were putting on teachers to deliver scores based on the balanced literacy expectations. And so that's kind of when I started to like build up a social media platform advocating for social justice in literacy instruction. Because I was like, do other people know this? Like, are other teachers going through the same struggle as me, where like what I'm seeing work for kids and like what brain research shows works for kids is what schools are like fighting against? And like surprisingly, but I guess like not so surprisingly, a lot of other teachers were like experiencing similar things or like wanted to learn a lot of this stuff. And like once they did, and like once they became part of the conversation, we're like trying new things with students and we're actually having results, like kids who like literally couldn't read a word, like actually starting to like sound out words and blend some letters together and notice things and make those connections that they just had never done before. And I mean, also like parents seeing my videos and posts about literacy and being like, oh, like I'm going to try this with my kid because their school is doing this balanced literacy thing and it's just really not working for them and he's struggling. And so that was really kind of cool to start to like build up this community, and feel like I'm actually doing like influential advocacy work that's outside of my school and outside of my my own community that's like able to spread. And it's like something that empowers me even more as an educator, because I know that I'm an effective teacher. I mean, nobody's a perfect teacher. That's something I love about teaching. Like you're always learning and growing, but like, I know I'm an effective teacher for my students in my classroom, but it's kind of validating, like to see these people like respecting your opinion about literacy as a young teacher and trying ideas that you have about implementing like research-based practice in their classroom. That feedback is just really positive. And I think a lot of young teachers, especially in the United States, don't necessarily get that positive feedback. And so kind of also wanting to share that with young teachers, like, hey, you can be successful and you can be empowered, and like people respect your opinions and think you're an effective educator and you're doing really good work. So that's become really, really cool too.
That's amazing. And I wanted to ask you about, so when you were in the school that employed balanced literacy, what did you feel at that point? Like, I know you said that it didn't make sense to you. It didn't make sense. class, but your internal feelings, what was that like? And the journey of those feelings coming to the structured literacy approach,
Yeah.
how did they transform?
Yeah. So at first, I just felt really frustrated and I kind of felt like it was all out of my control because I wasn't making curriculum decisions. I would sit through professional development meetings where they were telling us things that I just knew didn't make sense.
Mm.
And it was super frustrating. And then when I started doing more stuff like phoneme graphing mapping with high frequency words and having kids like look at word families and those kinds of things. Also doing like more phonemic awareness and phonological awareness, which are like really foundational reading skills. Um, and I like started to see things working. I was still frustrated at my school, but my feeling was kind of like, oh, like this is how you teach reading in a gen ed classroom. Like this is how it works with like most kids. And of course, like differentiation, you know, different um places and supports for different learners is important, but like the structures of the brain are pretty much the same. And so starting with this kind of philosophy and then working with kids where they're at on these specific skills that build these connections in the brain is like the approach that works for like 95% or something crazy of children. And so that thought was just kind of like, oh my gosh, like I have the tools to teach reading. Like this is how it works. So that was really empowering. And then at the end of the school year, I did end up leaving that school. Partially because I just wanted to move, but also partially because I couldn't continue to work in a place that wasn't employing the things that I knew were like absolutely imperative for children. And so then when I, you know, was looking for a new school, that was something that was really important to me. Like, what is literacy like at your school? Like, what are teachers able to have a say over at your school? And that's something that I like really want to empower teachers to do too. Like, your voice should matter. And like, that's something that you should seek out when you are seeking employment at schools, because if you're going to work at a school where nobody listens to you and you don't have a say over how you do something as like I guess common as teaching reading, that's really a red flag. And I think that we can kind of change the face of what schools are doing by teachers using their voice to make those decisions about where they're working and how they're working and what they're expecting of the district and the administration, like the principal and all of that stuff as well.
Absolutely. And so when you were looking at the school you're working at, what exactly were you looking for when you said, what is literacy like at your school?
Yeah, so one of the things that I was looking for or looking at was what curriculums they were using and then how much leeway teachers had from that curriculum to like support individual student needs. There's a lot of talk in the literacy community about fidelity, like how well you are sticking to the curriculum. But if the curriculum is flawed in the first place, and no curriculum is perfect, like it should be up to the teacher's discretion because they know the child best to give them the structured support that they need. And so I really liked the foundational skills curriculum that my school uses. And the administration trusts the teachers to make those decisions for students when something isn't working. So that was really important to me. And then another thing that was really important to me is a huge part of literacy is that background knowledge and vocabulary piece that I saw the kids who were having access to balanced literacy, like those were those kids, the kids who had background knowledge and the kids who had a robust vocabulary. And the way to do that for all kids is instead of just kind of choosing read aloud books to read willy-nilly and talking about, oh, this is a comprehension strategy you can apply in this book. And now, of course, like we read tons of books in my classroom just that we love. But when we're talking about building those specific things, my school does really nice science and social studies starting in pre-K and kindergarten and first grade. And that's a missing piece in a lot of schools where kindergarten and first grade is like just reading and math. Like they don't have that content piece. And so they're not really learning anything. They're just like learning how to do things. There's no application.
Yeah.
And so that was something that I was looking for as well, because I mean, the conversations that I'm having with 6-year-olds daily, and seeing kids put great words into their casual conversations with other kids, because it's something that we talked about in our social studies unit on like, we did an amazing unit on the like first people of the United States, and especially how they like efficiently farmed the land. And so talking about that and kids using that vocabulary to play a game at recess or, talk to their grown up at home, like that's just super cool. And then if they're reading a book and they see a word, they're like, oh yeah, like I know what that means because we talked about it in this context. And also like, I guess it means this too. So it must have multiple meanings. Like it's really, really deep language work that you wouldn't necessarily expect a 6-year-old to be able to do, but is like totally feasible if you're giving them the opportunities to be exposed to these things, like equitably at school. And so that was something that I was also looking for as well, because I mean, growing up, my favorite subject was history. And it's just such a shame that like at so many schools, you don't even get to start teaching any of that until like late elementary school when kids are like 9, 10, 11. And it's like, no, I mean, 5 and 6-year-olds are really interested in this stuff and they like apply that stuff to their real life and they have really good thoughts and ideas about it as well.
Isn't that so interesting that you bring that point up about history and like how we as humans compartmentalize these into such silo subject areas and have a hypothesis or predict that the child isn't going to understand because they're too young for it, yet history is probably one of the most important things for the knowledge building piece. Where did it come from? Like where was the starting point? And we are always doing that, past, present, future. What does the future look like? What does the present look like? And what did the past look like? How have we advanced in so many aspects of our current life? And that's where we're cultivating and facilitating these deep conversations with our children.
Absolutely. And I mean, if you think about kids, like their favorite question to ask is why? Well, why? Or like, what's that?
Yeah.
And when you're just teaching the skills of like arithmetic and reading, while those are like fundamental to be able to answer those questions, you're not giving them any kind of access to actually answering those questions, right? Because it's not applied. And so that's something that I also think too is really important, and allows kids to utilize their reading and math skills to answer the questions that they have about the world.
Exactly. And doesn't it just go to show that the idea of that simple view of reading,
Mhm.
or the formula decoding
Yes.
multiplied by language comprehension is what gives you reading comprehension, and it's
Yes.
strongest. It's the multiplication, it's not the addition, it's not
Yes.
any of the other division or subtraction. It is the multiplication, and requiring both of those aspects to be successful
Mhm.
at deep reading comprehension, as opposed to one
Right.
or the other.
Yeah. Well, and oftentimes, people will say, well, what about reading comprehension? What about reading comprehension strategies? And
Exactly.
the thing that I go back to with early readers is, well, have you checked on their decoding?
Mhm.
Because like that might be the part that's zero in the equation, right? Like what happens if you cover the picture in the book? Can they read the words?
Exactly.
What happens if you show them a nonsense word?
Mhm.
Like, do they have the skills to attack that word and try and figure out a logical way that would be pronounced? Because if not, the piece that's missing is not any sort of reading comprehension strategy. It's the fact that they simply don't have the letter sound connections that are strong enough and like vast enough to be able to access text without over relying on looking at the first letter of words and guessing, or looking at the picture and like assuming what the words say. And so that's like really, really, that's like the first thing I ask when someone says, well, what about comprehension? Or my kid can't comprehend. I'm like, well, hold on, like run it back. Can they decode? Because that might be the root of the issue, actually.
Yeah, correct. And it's so interesting sort of talking about both of those aspects of reading comprehension.
Yeah.
So I work at a few different schools,
Mhm.
and being a speech and language pathologist, previously it was a lot around language, oral language,
Right.
like the language component in written text, right? And
Mhm.
I was clearing a few documents from my laptop the other day, and I had one specific question in 2017 where I'd written, schools are talking about the language comprehension or reading comprehension, but what about the technical act of reading?
Mhm.
Why isn't that talked about? And that was my starting point into the science of learning, and going, why are we not talking about that? Do we know
Yeah.
enough about it? And if the child is unable to decode a word lifted off the page, then how is the child going to know the meaning of it if it's not read to the child? Like, they might make a mistake,
Right.
so therefore it might be the wrong word in the wrong phrase in the wrong sentence, and then the context, like,
Yeah.
meaning is compromised. So
Right.
why are we not looking at that side of it was yeah, just something I was
Yeah.
reflecting back on.
Absolutely. Like that question was like what kind of pushed me all last year when I was seeing the effects of balanced literacy in practice, and really thinking about like um if in order to do the act of reading, like I'm going to really nerd out for a second, like when I talk about the reading brain, but like um the first thing you do is you build this kind of pathway that's from the sounds of language to the letters or letter that spells that sound, and back, and that pathway builds first, right? And it's kind of a slow, laborious pathway. Like it takes a long time. And I think that's why people are like, oh, like this approach is lame. It's not effective. It's not working because it's not giving them the results they want as fast as they want.
Yes.
But I like to say, you got to go slow now to go fast later. Because if you don't go slow now, later you're going to be on such a shaky foundation that so many pieces are going to be missing and the child cannot be successful. And so later, as the child's brain orthographically maps these words, there comes this other more efficient meaning pathway where the kid is not only looking at the internal spellings and sounds in the word, but they're thinking about the meaning of the word in the sentence and the multiple meanings of that word and where they've seen that word before and what that word looks like. And that's a much quicker pathway. But I think balanced literacy and, the whole language approach in general thinks, oh, we can just jump straight to that pathway. And that's simply not the case. The kid has to look inside of the word before they can see the word as a whole and have those other connections. And so while this is like a slower process or like a more laborious process at the beginning when you're teaching the sounds and then all the different ways to spell those sounds, it's foundational to building the meaning pathway.
Yeah.
And you can't skip that process because then the meaning pathway is really, really shaky, and it's a tree that's missing branches and half of it's dead and the leaves are falling off, because it doesn't have any roots, it's hollow. And so that's something that's like really incredible to think about when you think about how reading develops in the brain, and also how as an adult, you don't necessarily remember the laborious process of you learning to read. It feels very unconscious because now you're relying on that meaning path and you have so many words orthographically mapped in your lexicon or your like head vocabulary that like it's nothing anymore. Once you're a proficient reader, it is nothing. You're an automatic reader. You can't look at a word and not read it because you just see it and you know it. But you have to build that in a really slow, solid, structured, explicit way, or else that can't happen as efficiently or really at all. And, part of it is I think like anecdotal researchers, when they were, I don't know, first making reading curriculums and coming up with the whole language approach and the balanced literacy approach and all that, like, I think they thought, oh, like reading is this unconscious process based on meaning because that's how it is for me as an adult. And like, they're right. That is how it is for you as an adult, but that's not how the brain starts to learn to read. And so I think that's, part of why the conversation is hard and confusing and receives backlash when it comes to the science of learning and the science of reading and structured literacy approaches because of how unconscious reading is later in life, despite these like specific steps that have to be taken to build the reading brain.
Absolutely. And, the idea of people being, or any human being able to memorize a bank of words, which can happen, and it's the faster process, but there is a saturation point. And then what happens if it's a different word? You memorize one word as opposed to the sounding out, where you can manipulate the sounds for different words, but this one memorized word, that's all that there is.
That's all you got.
Yeah. And explaining that to people or to parents or to, someone that isn't in the education field.
Yes.
And actually, that's a really good segue into how do we explain it to someone that isn't at a school, that isn't a teacher, maybe has a child, because I feel like literacy is a human issue.
Yeah.
Everybody has a role to play in it. Not to the depth of one's working in education, but you might have a child that might be struggling at a certain level. You don't have to be struggling severely, but you might have a niece or a nephew or a friend, like you might know someone. How do we explain it to them?
That's like my current kind of shift in my thinking. I mean, I'm such a nerd. Like I feel like I get really passionate and go down a rabbit hole of like one thing in literacy, and then I like, oh, okay, wait, no, now this is my focus and I'm really thinking about this a lot and I'm doing a lot of research on this. And that's something that I'm really focusing on right now, is how do we explain this to parents and like the education layperson so that it doesn't sound like this like neuroscience jargon, because I definitely like I know I definitely get there. And so like one of the things that like we do is every week at school we send home a spelling concept of the week. So instead of like a list of random spelling words that they have to memorize, right? We send them like a sound pattern. So short A words with a consonant at the beginning, consonant at the end. And there's so many words that fall into that category of spelling. And at the top of it, I mean, it's literally a one pager. It says, here's the spelling rule. And then here are a couple of examples. And we only give them a couple. And then the kids have to do work kind of throughout the week at home and at school, coming up with other words that apply that pattern, seeing if there's any exceptions and why those are exceptions. And just kind of that little like 2-sentence blurb at the top of like, this is the rule. Here are some examples. Some parents are like, whoa, I never knew that rule. Huh. You know? And it's literally just a sentence to read. It's a one pager. I've had it translated into other languages before, because like the science of reading does apply like across languages. And so that's something that like teachers can do once they have access to kind of the freedom to be able to pursue this structured literacy path. And it's a really, really simple way that shares what the kids are learning in school and like kind of why we're doing it this way, as opposed to maybe the memorized spelling list that you got when you were in school. Do you know what I mean? And then another thing that I talk about is like ways, like free, simple, like phonological awareness and phonemic awareness games that you can play, like in the car with your kid.
Yes.
Like, okay, we're going to the park. Where do you think we're going? Like, that is really super simple, and you can integrate it all day, every day. And once you know about it, it's super easy to implement with your kid. But like, if you don't have access to that information, it's maybe not something you're doing with them. And things like that are just as valuable to a child's literacy career as reading aloud to them at bedtime, or reading aloud to them with grandma and grandpa or whoever, like playing those kinds of games, or going in the car and looking at license plates and being like, oh, what sounds do you see on that license plate? Or singing songs like Rachel, Rachel, Bo Bachel, Banana Nana, Fo Fachel, Me, My, Mo Machel, Rachel, because that has rhyming words in it, like really, really simple stuff that once you hear it, you're like, oh yeah, I could do that. Like that's nothing, but you don't know that that's so impactful in literacy. Parents hear, oh, just read aloud to them, that'll be fine. And it's like, yes, that's important, but there's so many other easy things that you can do that you don't even need books for, that are like extremely influential in foundational literacy skills. And so I do a lot of posting about that. Like, here's a game you can play, no materials needed, like that kind of thing. Because I think that like a lot of parents just don't know where to start besides reading at home.
Yeah, absolutely, Rachel. And one thing I was thinking about is, while we have the knowledge around how reading is developed, how the brain works, and we know how impactful those small, or something that might seem trivial, but it's not. The brain is actually working so effectively, efficiently, and automatize these skills. But while we know that it's our bread and butter, but how do we get it out to, right, like parents to go,
Yeah.
guys, this is so important for the future, because that sort of read alouds, memorizing, they're the quick ones. That's where you can see, oh yes, okay, Johnny can read dog, cat, this, but are they sounding it out? Do they know what the sounds are? Can they manipulate it? Can they actually do? That's where I find a lot of the discussions, or just that lack of awareness, and how
Yeah.
you get better with spreading that message to go, okay, this is why we're doing. It might seem trivial, but I promise you it's not. It is
Yeah.
where we're and they're the foundational skills. Yeah, yeah. So
Exactly.
yes. And I was just mindful of the time as well. Rachel, it's been such a fantastic conversation.
I know. Yes.
I had so many other things. I was like, I'll ask this and that. But we might even do like a part 2,
Episode 2.
yeah, of this conversation. But before we do wrap up, is there something, I suppose, key takeaways for a 2-part question, one for teachers or
Yeah.
people working at a school, and one for parents from your
Yeah.
journey, your learnings?
Okay, so my takeaway for teachers, I think, is that teachers are advocates. There's so many like topics in education about which to be passionate and about which to want to like implement successfully in your classroom, and share with other people. And that like your voice to share these things really matters to educators at your school, but like maybe educators in your district, maybe educators in your whole city. Maybe it's something that is going to like impact the curriculum that your whole state adopts. And so that's something that I think is a really important takeaway. My passions are social emotional learning and literacy as a tool for social justice. And like I've taken those and been able to run with them, because I believe so much in the power of a teacher advocate. And so I think that that is my takeaway for teachers. And then I think my takeaway for parents is that there is so much to like expect when you're expecting a reader. And that reading aloud to kids is like not the end all be all. It's really important, but like reading aloud is where you want kids to ultimately get, right? And we have to lay some foundational skills to get there, but it's not something that should be a high stress, I have to buy a lot of things, kind of, oh, my nanny does that with my kid thing. It can be a really casual thing that you implement just as easy as reading a bedtime story to your child. And surprisingly, it is something that really is foundational to the development of the reading brain. And it's something that may not seem to be very important or influential, but it actually really, really is when it comes to cognitive education research. And so that's kind of the message that I would share with parents.
Beautiful. And just to wrap it up, social justice, equity in terms of reading, we, in today's world, we function with literacy. We partake in conversations, whether it's on text, on social media, with people. Literacy is paramount. It all.
Absolutely. I think I really even saw that come into play very recently. I was driving and normally I keep like little snacks or like protein bars in my car for when I see someone who's like homeless and they're holding a sign saying, any help needed, and I'll, give them a bar. And I was driving and I was stopped at a light, and there was this man holding a sign, and it wasn't even words. It was just like the letters that he knew. And this man was like 50 years old.
Wow.
And I like saw him, and I gave him a protein bar, and he was like, "Thank you. Like, God bless. Have a good day." But I saw that and I was like, this is the work, because this sweet guy, like, how is he supposed to get a job? How is he supposed to apply for a loan to get an apartment? Like, how is he supposed to register to vote so that his voice matters in our country? How is he supposed to open a bank account? Like, you have to sign papers and read these things. How is he supposed to know what ingredients are in the food that he's buying? Every single day you are using your literacy skills to just simply function in our and there is very little way that this sweet man could lift himself out of this situation without the access to literacy. And so I gave him the bar and like drove away, and then I ended up at my destination. I just was crying because I was like, this is why we do the work. Like, this is why it matters. It is a social justice issue. And so that's like always what I think about when I think about that sentiment.
That's exactly right. It is literally that social justice. It's chronic failure or any of that for any one of us humans will lead us to doing or be in a space we don't want to be in, that we don't. And that's where we need to think about when we're working with our students.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but no, thank you so much, Rachel, for taking the time to talk about your chapter and your passions for education and your role in it. So that's been so wonderful. And for anyone that's listening, if you connect with it, you think someone else will connect with it, please feel free to share this chapter. That would be really, really wonderful. And yes, until next time.
Thank you for having me.
You're very welcome.